שלום, אני אניח שכולם שומעים. צהריים טובים לכולם. חזרנו מארוחת צהריים נהדרת. Oh, and I'll switch to English? Do I switch to English? I should. Okay. So welcome back, everyone, from our lunch break. And I'm glad to introduce this afternoon's first session, Legacies of Power and Rule. Our first speaker is Professor Yael Berda from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Yael is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at the Hebrew University and a visiting scholar with the Middle East Initiative. Previously, she was the Weinstock visiting lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Harvard University and an academy scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Regional Studies from 2014 to 2017. She has taught at Princeton, NYU, Tel Aviv University, and Jindal Global University. Her research, teaching, and public speaking in the tradition of law and society scholarship is deeply engaged with historical legacies and contemporary politics. And I can say a lot more about her, but I think it will be better for you to hear her yourself. And you can see her, the title of her talk, the original title of her talk today is Legacies of Colonial Bureaucracies and the Shift to Authoritarian Regimes, Opportunity on the Brink of the Abyss in Israel, Palestine, and India. And I understand from the organizers that she will actually be speaking more on the Israel-Palestine context, but will also be referring to India. Is that right, Yael? Yes. Okay, so with this, welcome Yael. And
so yes, I was gonna try and do a connected comparative talk, only to realize that there was no way that I could actually do it justice in 20 minutes. So I'm gonna talk about the situation in Israel-Palestine mostly, and refer to the situation in India somewhat. So basically, we tend to delegate colonial rule to the past, or view it as contained to a population under colonial rule in the present, as in the case of Israel-Palestine. But there's hardly a discussion on the relationship between colonial and authoritarian rule in Israel-Palestine. This is not the case in India, where this question of that relationship between colonial rule and its legacies and authoritarian rule has actually been a consistent arena of debate. So because it has not in Israel, I'm going to focus on that. But I do, from my comparative work on the legacies of colonial bureaucracy and the making of citizenship in Israel, Palestine, and India, I rely on South Asian histories of bureaucratic power and the delineation of citizenship to offer a different view on Israel-Palestine that can help connect the contemporary regime coup, officially called the judicial overhaul, depends whose side you're on, to legacies of British colonial rule in the past and Israeli colonial rule in the present. So two definitions that are going to help me tell the story of this relationship. So one is the colonial rule of law, or government by emergency law. And the second is post-colonial citizenship, as opposed to the European story of the making of modern citizenship. And so these are kind of two definitions I'll be talking about. And I'm going to argue that one of the things that inheriting a system, almost a complete system of legal and administrative rule from a colonial state, what that enables is also using the set of security laws that also govern mobility to delineate citizenship. So I know I've just said a lot, and I'm going to unpack that. So this idea of the colonial rule of law, deeply discussed by Nasser Hussein during the early 2000s, a period dominated by the global war on terror, is that is that there is a liberal construction of the rule of law when it applies to subject races. That's the colonial rule of law. And its features are similar to European rule of law, with changes that are mainly visible in administration and bureaucracy of so-called subject races. And due to the sovereignty gap in the colonial state, what becomes is what Hannah Arendt called bureaucracy without government. It's a charismatic formulation that isn't entirely correct, because the very power of colonial governments was the fact that they did have a liberal semblance. They had an adherence to the rule of law. They were extremely concerned with juridical normativity, with exceptions. And the exceptions tell us the story, but it's important, I think, and this is why formulating it as bureaucracy without government or lawlessness becomes, it's not correct enough, and it can kind of takes us away from the importance of the semblance of rule of law and what is actually under attack at present. So what differentiates? And some, and I'm going to say this as a caveat, I know that one of the critiques to this kind of analysis is that no, there is no rule of law that does not have these big holes, these grand exceptions, you know, that we see with minority populations, that we see deployed at different times. And this is true. I do think that there is something particular when systematic exceptions become part of the principles of colonial bureaucracy, and what that enables is separate practices for different populations, different courts for different populations, and it amounts to totally separate legal systems, which is exactly where colonialism and liberalism break. So as soon as we have the institutionalized separation, that's where we can really say, okay, there's this difference here. But they do go a long way together. So in Israel, the possibility of living in a dual regime, territorially and politically, meant that rule by emergency, or the colonial rule of law, was a feature for sure in the territories occupied in 1967, and on that there is little debate, and on the territories in 1948, and on that that's a much more controversial statement. So rule by emergency is a set of authoritarian laws, and it was the heart of colonial rule, used not only for counterinsurgency in times of turmoil, it was also used to curb the freedom of movement and to regulate speech in a very deep way. Now, I'm not going to get into this, and I'm hoping that we're going to have time maybe during the Q&A to kind of talk about more examples of this. But I just want to advance the argument, so I'm not going to dwell on it. So the rule by emergency was a template for both the military government in Israel and its Arab citizens between 1949 and 1966, after the War of Independence, or the Nakba War, and then the military government over the territories occupied in 1967 that are governed through these emergency laws until this day. So the authoritarian rule part is a consistent feature of the regime, but it was contained by segregation, and in 1948, in the 1948 borders was negotiable as Palestinians holding Israeli citizenship negotiate what their citizenship entails, and in a way they grow their rights through these different negotiations, especially in the Supreme Court and through various legal advisors. And I'll just highlight that the very institutions that are the most under attack, since the judicial overhaul, are the institutions, the last frontiers, where Palestinian citizens of Israel could actually negotiate the meaning of their citizenship. And so I want to say that this relationship is a very strong one, and I'll explain. So if we agree that there were authoritarian elements in the inherited legal and administrative systems inherited from the British, even for those that reject the analysis of colonialism within the borders of 48, we can agree that there were these authoritarian elements, but it's not a strange discovery. So in India, scholars pointed out to the use of authoritarian rule for the sake of development. Sunil Kilnani and Singh recently wrote a wonderful piece in the Journal of Democracy. There's these 5 pieces about democracy and authoritarianism in India that I really suggest. Jyoti Raja's book on the authoritarian rule of law in Singapore ties in the way colonial legacies become the base plate of authoritarian rule. So they're not entirely visible, but they are the basis. And so emergency laws and citizenship meet when security laws can define citizenship, and this is a major argument that I'm going to make. So what do we have now happening with the regime coup? What is the relationship between the shift to authoritarianism and the kind of authoritarianism that we had as the remnant of British colonial rule and colonial rule over the Palestinians after independence? So, and I kind of feared, because I knew that most of the audience would be historians, and that's where, sociologists and historians on questions of continuity and change, that's where we divide, not least because sociologists are interested in the institutional patterns. Basically, how can we learn about these institutional patterns from their historical roots, and then how do they carry to the present, which of course many historians warn us from. So I want to say what I think the goal of the judicial overhaul / regime coup is. And it's kind of different than the view that is told most of the time. And I want to say that, just for maybe the sake of to remember, so the current Israeli government was elected in November of 2022, and introduced a few months later what it called the judicial overhaul. And in the coalition agreements, one could see many of the plans of the government, some of it which include the annexation of the West Bank formally, and other, and making a complete shift in the separation of powers between the Supreme Court and Parliament and the executive. And so many tend to look at that moment as the beginning of the judicial coup. But when you look at it from the perspective of minority citizenship, we could actually say that the regime coup already happened, or the regime change already happened. I won't say it's a coup. And it already happened regarding the political membership of Palestinians in Israel, and the protections on a political association. And what I'm saying is, in 2016, the anti-terrorism law basically was the first time that Israel formally legislated its emergency regulations, that it was governing counterterrorism through a set of emergency regulations and other laws, but this now it was formalized into an anti-terrorism law. And the second thing, that's 2016, with very wide definitions as to what it means to be affiliated with terrorism, what it means to incite to terrorism, and in a moment I'll elaborate on what that means for us today. In 2018, the nation-state law was legislated. The nation-state law basically declaring that that Israel is exclusively the nation-state of the Jewish people, also demoting Arabic, and I'm not going to get into the different articles of it because they're not important for my argument in particular. But I want to say that was the regime change, and it happens before. And what this judicial overhaul seeks to do is basically make that regime change irreversible. And so it has a lot more to do with the revocation and erosion of the citizenship of Palestinians in Israel than it has with its other goals. And what's so interesting about this is that while the most impressive protest movement in Israel began in 2023, a mobilization, very wide and extremely diverse mobilization, it does not address those aspects of the judicial overhaul. And what's interesting is in February of 2023, so this is maybe a month and a few weeks after the introduction of the judicial overhaul, as protests are going on and people are mobilizing against the plan, one vote went by that completely, as the protest movement looked the other way, and that was a vote on a law to revoke Palestinians the citizenship, well, not citizenship of those that had that had been indicted with a crime from the anti-terrorism law and had received some compensation from the Palestinian Authority. So their citizenship could be revoked, a very tiny minority. But what's interesting is that the first time the vote goes, the first vote, 106 members of the Knesset voted for that revocation. And then at the end of the vote, there were more who abstained, but it was a huge majority. And so this is happening a few weeks after the judicial overhaul. And after the judicial overhaul is announced, and to me that was a very curious moment, because it was obvious that this was a shift in Israel's citizenship regime. It was the first time that Israeli citizenship became revocable by law. There's a discretion given to the Minister of Interior to revoke citizenship based on different possibilities, and also to revoke residency based on different cases, but it had never been part of formal law. And so during this time of the judicial overhaul, that's when the first formal revocation of citizenship takes place, and literally the protest movement is looking the other way. Most of all of the Jewish opposition votes for it, and this tells you a different story about what is actually happening regarding the use of the authoritarian base plate. And so I want to explain a little bit about citizenship and the difference between the post-colonial and European European model of citizenship. Very briefly, because in order to understand the effects of the regime coup on citizenship in Israel, I think that we need to distinguish between liberal citizenship based on a European model and post-colonial citizenship. And for minorities, the latter type of citizenship is not a path to national liberation, but rather is a form of protection from deportation. So the story of citizenship, and this is I'm going with Siddiqui and some other scholars that have written extensively about post-colonial citizenship. So the story of citizenship is told as waves. This European citizenship is told as waves of mass mobilization demanding rights that grow. They grow citizenship in widening circles. The state grows, the citizenship, citizenry grows, and what it entails. Citizenship in post-colonial states had to be carved out of the emergency rule of law. It was not carved out through, it was not made through in the same process. And it was initially distributed through bureaucratic classifications that differed in scope and degree of rights from the very early days of the state. Citizenship grew from permit regimes. It grew from census accounts, and they were mostly geared towards minorities. Post-colonial citizenship needed to define rights and needed to define rights and political membership that did not exist previously in the racialized system of imperial citizenship, which created a rule of law of racial hierarchies, the one we talked about before. So I'm not going to go into it, but in my last book, in Colonial Bureaucracy and Contemporary Citizenship, I argue that for minorities in post-colonial countries such as Israel and India, citizenship was more of a mobility regime, granting a status of non-deportability. And then it doesn't remain there, it's a very dynamic thing. And then different populations negotiate the meaning of it in courts, through legislation, and that's how it shifts. The reason for this difference was that in the colony there were only subjects under a legal emergency regime that suspended rights of the entire population, and so for minority groups, post-colonial citizenship is not a binary process of inclusion or exclusion, but a political membership that enabled domination of different population groups based on racial, ethnic, or religious hierarchies. For those that had been turned into minorities through the making of borders and partition plans, citizenship was a tool to prevent deportation, and it was a basis for claims on the state. And so I like to think of it with Charles Tilly's view of citizenship, which is very thin and relational, and is basically the ability of a citizen to request and negotiate, to make claims on the state. And this is exactly the thinnest form that was given to minorities.
Sorry, Yael, we wrote you in the chat, we're not sure you saw it, that your time is almost up.
Right. So I'm gonna jump back to the present moment. So when we look at this kind of thin layer of post-colonial citizenship, And we see that the spaces for negotiation of both keeping up the rights of citizens and growing them, widening them, was mainly done in the Supreme Court. For a period of time, it was also happening in the Knesset. That's how the military government gets, the original military government gets dismantled in 1966 through a lot of mobilization in the parliament of both opposition, Begin, and Palestinian MKs. And then later, as the space for debate closed in Parliament, the Supreme Court became one of the only places where citizenship could be deliberated and negotiated and protected. And so for this reason, the Supreme Court is targeted. Not alone, but when we think of the Supreme Court and legal advisors as basically the last line that was holding up the separation between Israel and the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, legally holding on to this kind of image of of two separate regimes, not only an image, but also practices. But first of all, a semblance of the separation. We see that the attack of the authoritarian regime coup is exactly on those institutions that are upholding that separation. And
thank you.
What,
sorry, we
yeah,
have to. So just one last concluding sentence.
Yeah. So what we see is that there's this creation of one regime, no longer a separation between the liberal regime and the colonial regime. The authoritarian overhaul seeks to blend these two regimes and make them into one. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Yael. And thank you. I mean, we've all been living through the judicial overhaul and the changes for the worse that have been taking place in Israel since 2016. I have to say that as a historian of early modern Europe, it is strange to hear about what for me is the present being analyzed as a historical process that is in process right now. But yes, and we will, I'm sure, Yael, you'll be able to also refer to the comparison with the Indian context in the Q&A, which we will have at the end of the session. So, so thank you again. And our next speaker is Professor Inbal Ofer, who's a professor of contemporary European history at the Open University of Israel. Her work focuses on gender and fascist political culture in Southern Europe, the development of urban space under authoritarian regimes, and the role of urban social movements in democratization processes. Amongst her books are Claiming the City and Contesting the State, Squatting Community Formation and Democratization in Spain from 1955 to 1986, published by Routledge in 2018, The National Leadership of the, I can't pronounce it in Spain. Yes, from 1936 to 1977, so you can guess what this is about, which was published in 2009. And today she will be speaking about anti-system as an organizing concept, far-right radicalization during Spain's transition to democracy from 1968 to 1982.
Thank you, Tami. And I have to say, listening to all these titles, I realize I need to shorten the titles of my books and my presentations. Okay. Okay, the current presentation forms part of a larger research project that analyzes the ideological construction and the militancy structure of second-generation neo-fascist organizations in Spain and Italy between the 1960s and the early 1980s. The project's goal is to understand the ways in which organizations such as Nucleo Armati Rivoluzionario, Tres Opposizioni in Italy, or the Frente de la Juventud and Frente Nacional de la Juventud in Spain interpreted the concept of anti-system, in which they made ample use. What type of relations did the militants within these, what type of relationship did they maintain with elements of the far-right parties that operated within existing parliamentary structures in both countries? How did they view the pre-1945 fascist political culture? And finally, can one distinguish a neo-fascist anti-system counterculture that formed in reaction to the events of May 1968 and shared the students' movement's generational profile, but was characterized by profoundly different sociocultural inspirations and militancy patterns? Now, second-generation neo-fascist organizations differ from neo-fascist organizations and movements that formed in the early years following the Second World War on several fronts. They were founded by young men and women who were born for the most part during the decade of the 1950s. Their militants had no first-hand knowledge of fascism in its heydays, nor were they marked by the events of the Second World War or the Spanish Civil War. Second-generation organizations were smaller, more agile, and less committed to ideological production than their predecessors. But above all else, they were distinguished by the unequivocal adoption of violence as a core political strategy. Despite their reduced size, these organizations were responsible for a series of terrorist attacks from the late 1960s that undermined public security and political stability, thereby contributing to the spiraling dynamics of political violence that was fed both by the far right and by Maoist and Marxist-Leninist armed guerrilla groups in both countries. Unlike the far right parties from which they emerge, such as Movimiento Sociale Italiano or Fuerza Nueva in Spain, second-generation neo-fascist organizations left behind them few sources for those of us who are interested in reconstructing their histories and understanding their members' motivations and patterns of mobilization. Some authors, such as Mariano Sanchez-Soler or Eduardo González-Calleja, supplemented the scarcity of the archive by resorting to press coverage and court proceedings. My analysis builds on these studies while at the same time focusing on three additional types of sources: political pamphlets, ego documents, and interviews conducted with former militants. Autobiographic texts written by militants such as Stefano Di Lacchia, Ernesto Mila, or Francesca Mambo describe a hectic scene of organizations and splinter groups in constant flux. These texts were written during the second decade of the 21st century, at a point in time in which most of the protagonists had already completed substantial prison sentences and were no longer politically active. They provide little reliable information regarding the involvement of these men and women in the major terrorist attacks that were attributed to them. Life story interviews and ego documents produced by ex-militants are characterized by a great degree of semantic segmentation. While they do not always provide a coherent historical narrative, they nonetheless shed light on the motivations and nature of political militancy. Now, Weinberg and Uberg, in their book, The Rise and Fall of Italian Terrorists, emphasized the fact that the massive wave of political violence that assailed Italian society from the late 1960s cannot be explained simply by resorting to conspiracy theories, be it the strategy of tension that interpreted neo-fascist violence as intended primarily to induce a spiraling left-wing violence, followed by internal collapse of political systems and a military coup, or the idea that neo-fascist violence, that neo-fascist violence was facilitated by outside or external agents, among them politicians and elements within state security services. The value systems, symbolic universe, and broad social forces at work, which serve to sustain violence for so long among so many, must be understood. Second-generation anti-system neo-fascism emerged in Europe in the late 1960s in response to three interrelated challenges: a value crisis that affected the entire political system and was fed on the right by a growing sense that European civilization was once again threatened by Marxist forces; a fear that the existing economic power structures would be undermined in light of the re-emergence of a clandestine labor movement in Francoist Spain, and the radicalization of the Italian labor movement that culminated in the hot autumn of 1969. Finally, under vastly different conditions, the vulnerability of the post-World War political system in Italy and the post-Civil War political system in Spain were becoming apparent. In Italy, a democratic coalition led by social Christians, which included the neo-fascist party Movimento Sociale Italiano and was supported for the most time from the outside by the Communist Party, was shaken by the combined effects of the 1968 events in May and the failed Borghese coup in 1970. In Spain, a dictatorial regime that was founded during the Civil War was destabilized in 1973 following the assassination of General Francisco Franco's designated, like this? Is it better? This way? It's better?
Maybe this one?
Okay. לא, זה בסדר, זה לא, השאלה אם זה לא חזק מדי. חזק? Okay. So going back to 1973, the destabilization of the Francoist political system started, well, it started during the 1960s, but the three major events were in 1973, the assassination of General Francisco Franco's apparent heir, Admiral Francisco Carrero Blanco, by the ETA underground, followed by the death of the dictator himself in November 1975, and followed afterward by a long and very volatile process of democratic transition. Now, the regime that was founded by General Francisco Franco following the Spanish Civil War was the last of the pro-Axis regimes to survive in Europe. Under Franco's rule, the Spanish fascist movement, Falange Española, had become a basis of the regime's powerful single-party apparatus, while fascism itself constituted by one current within the regime. I think I'm going to go back to that. You don't have to excuse me. I'll just keep it away from myself, so it won't make that much. Its adherents firmly controlled Spain's syndical system and its youth movement. It is therefore not surprising that by the mid-1940s, the Spanish capital had become a refuge point for leading fascist figures. Some made the city their home, created... Still out? Okay. חשבתי שזה חזק מדי. אוקיי. אני הרגשתי איכשהו שאני מדברת חזק מדי, בגלל זה התרחקתי ממנה. Okay. It is therefore not surprising that by the mid-1940s, the Spanish capital had become a refuge point for leading fascist figures, turning Madrid slowly but surely into a key node in the transnational neo-fascist network. By the 1960s, however, the fascist current within the regime was losing ground, and a new generation of Opus Dei technocrats, as they were called, were laying the ground for what would become known as the Spanish economic miracle, working to combine Catholicism with ultranationalism and a controlled economic liberalization process. Against this background, in 1966, we see the creation of two new far-right entities that would shape the Spanish political scene in the years to come. In Madrid, Blas Piñar founded the editorial Fuerza Nueva that would evolve during the transition to democracy into Spain's largest far-right party, one which defined as its goal, and I'm quoting, fighting to defeat the anti-Christian and anti-national revolutions of our time, the liberal, the Marxist, and the erotic revolution. In Barcelona, the Circle of Spanish Friends of Europe was founded as an umbrella organization for a host of neo-Nazi entities, adhering to the 1952 Zurich Manifest that defined race as the basis of all culture, and Europe as a single geographical unit in which the white race is conserved in its unitary form. A third organization, much smaller but important nonetheless, represented a current of Falangist revisionism. It was called the Circles of José Antonio, named after the Falangist founder, José Antonio Primo de Rivera, and their objectives moved between a variety of different issues, objecting to the reinstitution of monarchy in Spain, calling for the establishment of more political association, albeit under a single party structure, and again calling for the separation of church and state. As this very brief overview makes clear, what could be considered as a Spanish far right during the final decade of the Francoist dictatorship vastly varied in its ideological roots. While ultra-nationalist, radically anti-democratic and anti-individualistic, it varied in its views regarding religion, traditionalism, and the eugenicist nature of the state. The men and women who would become leading figures within the Frente de la Juventud and Frente Nacional de la Juventud started their political apprenticeship, for the most part, either within the circles of revisionist Falangism or in one of the neo-Nazi groups in Barcelona. The presence of a leading Italian neo-fascist activists in Spain from the late 1970s provided them with additional inspiration and transnational connections. By the early month of the transition to democracy, however, most of them came to be affiliated with Blas Piñar's ultra-conservative, deeply Catholic, and monarchic Fuerza Nueva. Some of the young militants had come to see revisionist Falangism as too populist, while others felt that neo-Nazi groupings were too splintered and small to make an impact. Fuerza Nueva, on the other hand, consolidated its position as a mass movement. But this militancy too was too short-lived for them. While benefiting from the destabilizing effect of its young militants' violent actions, Blas Piñar refused to officially back them. In the summer of 1977, he suspended military training within the party and prohibited the use of neo-Nazi symbols. As a former militant in Fuerza Nueva testified 3 decades later, and I'm quoting, "Fuerza Nueva was a party of grandfathers and grandsons. Worse yet, it was a party made up of retired men and students, in some cases school students. It was a party where men who did not understand why Spain had changed on them all of a sudden gave instructions to young people, some of them children, who did not yet have the capacity to politically analyze the society in which they lived." The breach within Fuerza Nueva was not just generational, it was also cultural. Ernesto Milá, the co-founder of Frente Nacional de la Juventud, whom I interviewed in Barcelona in the summer of 2022, spoke at length of the suffocating environment at the central offices of Fuerza Nueva in Madrid, where the bells would chime at 8 o'clock every evening, calling for everyone to attend Mass. He stated he himself was kicked out of the party by Blas Piñar a few months prior to the secession of his men, when choosing to marry his companion in a civil ceremony. In 1977, a violent act of secession finally occurred, leading to the foundation in Barcelona of one front and in Madrid of another one. As part of the innovative spirit which the Frente Nacional de la Juventud brought with it into the scene of ultra-nationalist politics in Spain, it also chose for the first time to import a militancy model that formed in Italy during the years of Led, by militants such Stefano Della Chia and Valerio Fioravanti. Between 1977 and 1982, newly formed right-wing anti-system entities in Spain and Italy experimented with an array of violent tactics: ambush attacks, armed raids, the use of grenades and explosives. The targets varied according to their definition of what was or what could be considered the system, from government buildings in Italy to banks, bookstores, the offices of leading newspapers and the headquarters of left-wing parties, as well as professional associations which cooperated with Spain's labor movement. A young generation of neo-fascist militants embraced violence and chaos as a leading political tactic. In the words of the Italian Francesca Mambo, co-founder of Nuclear Armati Rivoluzionari, "We had no interest in seizing power, nor in educating the masses. What counts for us is our ethic, and what an ethic, to kill enemies and annihilate traitors. The will to fight keeps us going from day to day, and the thirst for revenge is our food." Now, Mamber's words beg a question. If not in the name of a coherent ideology, not in order to seize power, not in order to educate the masses, what were these young men and women fighting for? Perhaps the greatest influence on this new generation of militants came from the Italian thinker Julius Evola. Evola's whole political writings between the 1920s and the 1970s varied in subjects, spanning everything from political philosophy, Stoicism, and practices of magic and Eastern religions. While many studies refer to the Evolian influence on the development of neo-fascist ideology, leading scholars are divided regarding the nature of his work. Some, like Elisabetta Wolff, view Evola as a fascist thinkers. Others, like James Gregor, focus on the traditionalist nature of his philosophy. I would like to point out that I do agree with the assertion made by Franco Farinelli, probably the only one who analyzed systematically neo-fascist corpus of thinking against that of Julius Evola's writing himself, that Evola was one of the most radical and consistent anti-egalitarian, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and anti-popular thinkers in the 20th century. And while he did not easily fit any one category, some of his major works, such as Note on the Third Reich and Fascism Viewed from the Right, demonstrate that neither was he a fascist. How then can we explain the fascination of this young generation with his work? Evola's most radical and relevant work for the neo-fascist struggle was in his 1961 book, Riding the Tiger, an escalation from his political doctrine represented in A Man Standing Among the Ashes a couple of years earlier. There he vehemently expressed his hatred for the modern condition, condemning contemporary institutions, values, habits, and the beliefs, all of them as diseased, doomed, and decaying. In his post-1945 writings, Evola coined the concept of apoliteia, internal detachment from politics, in order to avoid the contamination of the modern world. He further elaborated in his model for the ideal historical man, the unbroken man, dedicated to values of inner transcendence, asceticism, courage, and self-sacrifice. Valerio Fiorentini, Francesca Mambo's partner and the co-founder of Nucleo Armati Rivoluzionari, spoke of the Evolian influence when he was interviewed from prison in the 1990s, and I'm quoting, "From this perspective, armed struggle was one path to take. We believed that in working towards changing men, it was necessary to overcome the feeling of fear of death, fear of the loss of freedom. I remember myself as a 15, 16, 17-year-old, I found myself fighting in order to forge my own character. That was the only thing I could do, the only thing that my mind could conceive and realize as an act of liberation at that time." While Evola spoke of the unbroken man, the life stories of women like Francesca Mambo and Sandra Gocce attest to the adoption of this model across gender lines. Indeed, one of the characteristics of both the Frente Nacional de la Juventud and Frente Nacional de la Juventud in Spain was the relatively high number of female militants, and it's nearly 40%, which is quite a bit. It's quite a bit in all, no matter how we consider it, and especially when we're thinking about Franco's Spain in its final years. In his autobiography, Ernesto Milá spoke at length of the place of women, and I'm quoting, "There were many young women, great women. How could we not welcome them into the front? They had precisely what we were looking for, the hubris of a first-line militant, energetic commanders, militants who did not hesitate to go where no one else in a traditional far right dared to go." By 1982, the violent activism of second-generation neo-fascist organizations was waning out. The failure of the Tejero group in Spain in February 1981 discouraged many militants, and a massive wave of arrests in both Spain and Italy followed the terrorist attacks of 1980, of which probably the best known one is the one in the Bologna train station, where over 80 people were killed and over 200 people were injured. I would like to suggest that but even without outside influence, I would like to suggest that neo-fascist anti-system militancy was not made to last, unlike that of their contemporaries in the Marxist-Leninist left. Violent, individualist, and lacking in a clear political project, it was intense and brief. In the words of Milá, who was in charge of recruiting many of the young men and women of the time, formal training in the Frente Nacional de la Juventud served little purpose for us. By the time we would have them ready, they were done with us. They would find a girlfriend, start their studies, start their military service. So we figured out that there was no point in formal preparation. If militants were to last a year, 2 years max, what were we going to do with them? Out of this realization grew a different tactic, that which we came to call the theory of lemon. Push militants to give what they had, everything that they had, explore the potential of their activism to its fullest for several months. And then, when they go back home, bring in a new batch of street fighters. Young men and women with ultra fervor. But this strategy had implications. It implied that there was no need for reflection, no need for full developed doctrine, nothing, only high levels of testosterone. Now, I would like to pause here for a moment. I think I have a minute or, okay. So I would like to pause here with the Spanish case and just go back reflectively for a moment to the discussion we had yesterday. As a historian, living in a society where what we defined until a very short time ago as anti-system entities, and seeing now how these anti-system entities are actually becoming part of the system itself, okay? I have to say this is a very scary, for me, I'm sure for all of us, a very scary experience. And yet I'm suspectful of the attempts of transferring concepts and historical conclusions from one era to the other. I would like to conclude with two observations that go back to the discussion yesterday. The first one is regarding these anti-system entities. I want to say that despite the fact that many of us see them as the problem, I don't think that they are the problem. I think they're a symptom. They're a symptom of a much wider problem, of a society in which many groups are progressively are not identifying themselves anymore with the system. Now, this is no criticism. I'm not saying that the problem is with the system. I'm saying that the solution goes via understanding how alienated these groups and why they're so alienated. And a final remark, I think it was Ronnie who spoke yesterday about acknowledging fear. You said asked whether it would be a useful tactic. And I want to say something which is very obvious, I think, but still needs to be stated. In order to acknowledge something, we need to understand it. And in this respect, I think that as historians, what we bring to the table in this moment in time in Israeli society is a set of very useful tools for systematically and critically analyzing that which we are so afraid of. And I think this is, my point of view is that it's probably one of the most important lessons that we need to teach our students and society around, how to use these tools in order to analyze the things we see in front of us and start understanding how to combat them.
Thank you, Inbal. That was fascinating. And again, we will have time for a Q&A at the end of this session. And our next speaker now is Professor Ruth Ginio of Gurion University. She's professor of history, and her field of expertise is French colonialism in West Africa. She's authored 4 books and many articles in 3 languages. 3 languages? Yes, no, I'm just... just making sure I'm getting it right. And I'll just mention the books. There's now one that is currently in press, forthcoming in Manchester University Press in 2025, The Illusion of Colonial Justice. An earlier one is The French Army and Its African Soldiers, The Years of Decolonization, which was published by Nebraska University Press in 2017, and European Colonialism, which was published in Hebrew by the Open University Press in 2012, and also French Colonialism Unmasked, which was published by Nebraska University Press in 2006. Today, she will be speaking about, the title of her talk is Against All Odds, the Senegalese Democratic Experiences.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm going to take you to a region of the world that I suppose not many of you know. There's one person here who knows, so I can't just tell you whatever I want. She'll know. This is Senegal. And I'm going to speak about the democratic experience of Senegal and try to explain the title Against All Odds is taken by a wonderful song that maybe the older of you know. But it's actually really against all odds in this case because Senegal is surrounded by countries who are not stable politically and has kept for many years its democratic regime. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, what I'm going to do is, first of all, introduce Senegal briefly, so that we'll know where it is and what we're talking about. And then, as a historian, I'll start by looking at the colonial origins, the historical origins of Senegal, this democracy, and try to explain its situation, current situation, by its past. I will then go, follow it, discourse of democratic experience after independence, and then find perhaps offer some other explanations for the resilience of democracy in Senegal that are not specifically historical. Finally, I will try to say something about the question of will Senegalese democracy survive, but as you know, historians barely know anything about the past. They cannot really say much about the future. So I don't promise any prophecies here. Sorry. Okay, so this is Senegal on the west coast of Africa. As you can see, it is actually almost divided by another country, the Gambia, which was a British colony. Actually, the French really didn't want that to happen, but the British enjoyed doing this. And during the colonial period, it was very difficult for the French to control this area southern of Gambia, which is called Casamance. It was locked between the British and the Portuguese, and in independent Senegal, it was also problematic. This region wanted autonomy. It was actually one of the major problems that Senegalese governments had to deal with. Also, you can see the baobab tree, which is the symbol of Senegal. If you go there, you can see a lot of these trees. Just briefly about Senegalese society, the official language is French, but there are 6 national languages, of which one, Wolof, is the most widely spoken. Actually, almost everyone speaks it either as first or second language, which also helps, of course, social cohesion. It is not a tribal society. It's built on professional case, and there are many inter-ethnic marriages. Religion is, well, 95% of the Senegalese are Muslims. About 2% are Christians, but if you go there on Christmas, you would be sure that you arrive to a Christian country. They really like to celebrate holidays, doesn't matter if they're their own or others. And 3% are traditional religions, but actually almost 100% also hold traditional religions. So they are only some Christians and also have these pre-Christian beliefs, or Muslims and have pre-Muslim beliefs. As for the political structure, it's a multi-party system, a unicameral house that's called the National Assembly, like in France. It has a president and prime minister, and a separation of religion and state in the constitution. No religious parties are allowed. The party cannot declare itself to be religious in its goals. And mandatory 50% women in every list according to the Gender Equality Law of 1910, which meant that gradually they have almost half of the parliament female. Economically, it's a very poor country. The currency is franc CFA, which is actually the colonial franc. They just changed the F from français to financier. They always try to find something with F. It always works. It's an agricultural-based economy. Peanuts is the most widely produced product, and fishing also. There are some possible future gas sources in the sea. They keep speaking about it for ages, but still haven't been able to produce anything, and money sent by immigrants is an important part of the economy. There is a very big influence of the French and control over the economy that is resented by many people. And the Chinese now attempt to push out the French, and they succeed partly. Why is it stuck? It's stuck. So I don't know why it moved. Does it move? What did I do? Oh, okay, it moved. Okay, just a photo. This is a lady selling peanuts in the streets of Dakar. Anyone who is allergic to peanuts should not go in the street there because it's in the air all the time. And some Senegalese fishermen. Okay, so just to explain, because I'm talking about democracy, what we're talking about, okay? It is not, of course, perfect. No democracy is perfect. The grade that they get from the House of Freedom, which is a site that kind of puts numbers on democracies, which is, of course, a bit problematic, but it gives you a general idea. They give that as 67 out of 100, which is actually at the top part of the partly free. And what they say is, as you can see, that Senegal is one of Africa's most stable electoral democracies and has undergone peaceful transfer of power between rival parties since 2000. And there are some problems like restrictions on press, intimidation, persecution of opposition leaders. I'll talk about it a bit. And of course, problems with rights of LGBT, which is a problem in all of most of Africa. But there, at least, they do not implement. They have terrible laws, but they do not implement them, which is something, I guess. Just for comparison, this is our grade, 74 this year, but not for of course, the territories, just for Israel within this green line that doesn't exist anymore. And that's 74, which is actually the low part of free. Not much about Senegal. Who knows what our losses number will be next year? Just have to guess. Okay, so I'll go back to the past. Okay, so one of my actually theories about why Senegalese democracy is resilient is the historical explanation that begins somewhere in the 19th century. This is what you see here is Saint-Louis of Senegal. Which used to be the capital of Colonial Senegal, and together with Dakar, Rufisque, and Gorée was considered one of the 4 communes where the French gave in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, citizenship to all of the inhabitants of these cities, including the community of the Métis, which were like had French fathers and African mothers, and Africans living there and their descendants. This is one of the Métis leaders who was actively politically. They could, the population could send a representative to the National Assembly in France and had their own electoral democratic institutions. This man, Blaise Diagne, the new Chinese-built airport in Dakar is named after him. He's actually the one who begins the African involvement in politics. He was the first African to be elected as a representative to the French Parliament. And from there on, there is an active democratic political life, very limited because France extends during the late 19th century its rule over the entire territory of Senegal and then the rest of the territories in French West Africa. And the other people, all these millions of people, do not get any status at all. They are colonial subjects. So we have, like, at the end of Second World War, about 10,000 citizens, out of which about half are women, and women get citizenship only after World War II, like they do in France. So there is really a few thousands of people who can enjoy democracy, but I think it's very, very important because it's a very great different from other colonies, because the elite knows what democracy is, and it knows the game. And when independence comes, it's not like, okay, have a democratic constitution and we are going, and just, you know, do whatever you want. And this is something that they actually know from their own experience many years before. Oops, sorry. Wow, do I go back? So another important phase is in 1946, a new constitution that establishes the French Union, gives citizenship to everyone, but actually not citizenship of France, but citizenship of what's called the French Union. But by 1952, all Senegalese can vote for elections. And Léopold Sédar Senghor, who is a great poet and also the first president of Senegal, understands that the game has changed. Others do not understand that so quickly, and that he has to influence now a lot of people who cannot read and write and cannot be influenced through the media. So what he does is recruit, not this guy because he's already dead, as you can see, in 1927, but his Sufi order, it's called Mouridia, that until today, now recently it lost a lot of its political power, but until recently was very strong politically. And he actually makes this deal with him that this Sufi order will convince its disciples to vote for Senghor's new party, the BDS, that's how it's called, sorry. It's called the Bloc Démocratique Sénégalais. And that works for him. And he wins, and actually during these years, after he wins, he is a political genius, and he actually succeeds in co-opting a lot of his political rivals. This is Touba in Senegal. This is the holy city for the Mourids, where Amadou Bamba is buried, and this is a very impressive mosque over there. Okay, so what happened after independence? 1958, the French institute the Franco-African Community, which accords autonomy to all its territories, but they keep the security and foreign affairs in their hands. But this breaks really quickly, and in 1960, after a failed attempt to form a federation with Mali, Senegal becomes independent by itself. Democracy lasts for 2 years only. In 1962, Senghor accuses his prime minister, Mamadou Dia, of planning a coup d'etat, and which actually was probably false, and he takes its opportunity and changes the political regime in Senegal into a one-party regime. Some of it is by cooptation and by just kind of making one party of all his opposition parties, whoever accepts it. Sorry. But this situation continues for 6 years, and it's challenged in May 1968. The global students' revolt all over the world, and Inbal mentioned it for Spain as well. Students revolt demanding Africanization of the university and of there's a lot of still French people working in Senegal. There are actually even French cab drivers. So it's not only the upper echelon that is occupied by the French, but also much inferior jobs. And they also demand democratization and opening of the political system, or reopening of the political system. Workers join the students. As you know, students by themselves normally do not succeed without workers kind of supporting them from behind, and they do support them. And a major political crisis occurs. It takes a few years for Senghor to decide what to do and how to solve the problem, and finally decides that the only option is going back to democracy. And he declares that from now on, Senegal will have 3 parties. One will be left-wing, the other will be right-wing, and he will be comfortably in the middle. His party is declared as be center, which he thinks would be more attractive than the others. He then adds another party. But in, again, 6 years later, in 1980, Senghor does something incredible that no one in Africa, and I don't know if anywhere else had done before. He resigns of his own will. He's not waiting to be pushed. He's just saying, yeah, I did enough. Now I'm going to Normandy with my French wife and just retire from politics. And he does something that is not really democratic. He does not declare elections. He appoints his second in command, Abdou Diouf, as president. But youth actually continues this process of democratization, and in the same year it declares that Senegal from now on is a multi-party regime, which means that everyone, according to certain rules, can establish a party, and it's not limited only to 3 or 4 parties. So I think one of the major tests of democracies, as we know, some people in Israel would say that only in '77 there was actually proof that a political shift is going well, and this is actually proving that the democracy is really stable, because until then there was no shift of power in Senegal, but since 2000 there has been 3. In 2000, Abdoulaye Wade won the elections, and it went smoothly. Youth became very important in got other prestigious positions all over the world, and he left Senegal and was okay with that. It was no, how do you say it, zero-sum game, losing his seat as president. In 2012, Abdoulaye Wade was almost 90 years old, and he actually tried to change the constitution, and until then it was limited, the terms of a presidency was limited to 2 terms, and he wanted some more years. He thought he was still young and powerful, and he tried to extend it to a 3rd term, which caused upheavals, and people went to the streets and protested. Macky Sall, who was the opposition leader, led this protest and was elected in 2012. But of course, he also, after 2 terms, felt like staying, and there were rumors that he was going to do the same and extend and change the constitution. He didn't do it, but he was really afraid of what's going to happen when the man who was the most powerful rival of his party, a man by the name of Ousmane Sonko, had very good chances to be elected. And it's interesting because Macky Sall could not run again, so he was not worried about himself. He was worried about his party. He was worried about an elite that was going to lose power to a group of young people, radical, they called them radical, with different notions, who didn't want French control anymore. So what Macky Sall actually did was try to find all sorts of allegations and open court cases against his rivals. Some of them were probably invented or even ridiculous. In the case of Ousmane Sonko, it's not clear if it was true or not, but he was accused in 2021 of raping a massagist, a woman working in a spa, which is frequented. There were 2 years of investigations in which he could not, you had problems of running his party. And in 2023, he was put to trial, and because there was no proof against him, he was accused by corrupting the youth, because this woman was young. So apparently they say, okay, maybe you had sex with her, it was not rape, but you corrupted her, and therefore you cannot run for presidency. There were lots of protests also in the streets, and finally, a few months later, there was an appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that he can be re-enlisted, but it was too late, and the lists were already closed. So this guy, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who was not that popular, was not that known, and very young, he was his second in command, and he was the candidate instead of him. But because everyone knew that actually the man who's running the show is Ousmane Sonko, he won the elections in March 2024, and that was actually the last time where when a political shift arrived. Just to say that before that, the elections were not supposed to be in 24, it was supposed to be a few months before, and Macky Sall, when he felt that he was going to lose, he actually postponed the elections to an unknown date. And this caused much concern in the world about Senegalese democracy, and there were even prophecies that that's it, that's the end of Senegalese democracy. The first time that it happened also was that they forbade, they shut down the internet, things that were never done before in Senegal. It was really a worrying situation. But finally, under pressure, Macky Sall stated a date of March for the elections and lost, and left peacefully. Just to finish, I know that I have, just one sentence to finish is that there's other explanations which I promised. There are several explanations except what I said, the historical one. I think, first of all, the religious tolerance in Senegal is very important, especially if you see what happens in other countries. It's strong enough to resist, this tolerance strong enough to resist the threats of jihadist movements all around. The non-ethnic politics is very important because, if you know, as you know, ethnic politics is anti-democratic because the results are kind of, you see them in advance and there are no hope for change. But I think the most important thing is that democracy in Senegal is the national pride. It's something that people, when you ask them what's the most important thing, what do you say about Senegal, say, oh, we are democratic, we are not like the others. And I think that this pride is something that actually preserves democracy, and of course the financial support that comes with it, because all the NGOs come to Dakar and they get a lot of support from Western regimes. So for the future, I think that as long as this is going to continue, that being Senegalese means belonging to a democratic country and being proud of it, I think maybe there are some causes for optimism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruti, for the hope that you leave us with hope. It's always a good thing, and we do need it desperately. So thank you for this hopeful message and for very rich presentation, and also for being very punctual with the time, and which will leave us enough time, hopefully, for the discussion later on. And our next and last speaker for this session is Dr. Yoel Kornreich, who's an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University. His research focuses on comparative politics, the welfare state, public participation, and policymaking within authoritarian regimes, drawing on extensive fieldwork and archival research conducted in China. His contributions have been included in top journals such as Governance, the China Journal, PLOS Global Public Health, Modern China, and Communist and Post-Communist Studies. And he's currently completing a book manuscript on expert participation and deliberation in authoritarian regimes. Today, he will be talking about navigating uncertainty, the use of expert deliberation in China's policymaking.
Thank you for the introduction. I hope that you can hear me. I guess you do. What? Okay, now it should be fine. And first of all, I would like to briefly thank the conference's organizing for putting a very engaging conference under quite challenging circumstances. So thank you for that. I'm going to talk about China, and in certain sense, this is a regime that, according to some definition, is a totalitarian regime, remains a totalitarian one, and never quite made it to the post-totalitarian stage, even in its most relatively open or liberal periods. So this is a regime that is more dictatorial or authoritarian than Putin's Russia, than past fascist regime, and even here, let's say, even if Israel is going to go, if this judicial coup is successful, still China is going to be far more authoritarian than Israel will ever be. If it's consoling in any way. But anyways, what I'm interested, so this is not a consolation, but what I'm going to talk about. So this is a very dictatorial regime, Leninist regime, and even though, in spite of those things, the regime at certain times promotes deliberations and discussions and so on, and even 20 years ago began to adopt this idea of deliberative democracy, an idea that from normative political theory in the West, the ideas of Habermas and Arendt, and try to think how do we actually adapt these ideas into the Chinese context, not in order to democratize, of course, but in some ways how to sustain authoritarian rule. Now, what I'm doing in my research is really to try to understand this puzzle of totalitarian or very strict authoritarian regime that is promoting deliberation and participation. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is really to talk about a very micro example of how the regime is promoting deliberation in settings that are somewhat like academic conferences of experts. So that's the topic. How do I move the slides here? The mouse. Oh, here, this one. Okay, so just click. Okay, that's easy. So I'm going to talk about how the regime is navigating uncertain situation when politicians, leaders, they seek their utility, they need to calculate, but sometimes the environment is more complex. There are interactions among different factors that evolved and changed together, so they don't really know what to do. And obviously, this situation of uncertainty is never unique to authoritarian regimes. It also happens in democracies. But maybe what is different about authoritarian regimes is also the political uncertainty, that we don't have stable and predictable institutions. We don't have third-party mechanisms to ensure that the losers don't lose everything. And this is why uncertainty can even be more severe, and the fear of making political blunders that are going to lead to the loss of popular legitimacy and perhaps to a revolt are a serious concern, and this is why authoritarian regimes or autocrats may be troubled by situations of uncertainty. If we're talking about China, there is a very unique way of doing things, of handling uncertainty, and this idea that is coming, even originating from the pragmatist philosophy of John Dewey, who influenced Mao Zedong and so on. The idea is we're not going to just formulate a policy from above at the center in Beijing, but we're actually going to try what is working on the ground in specific localities, and if it works, then we're going to upscale it to the rest of the country. If it doesn't work, we're just going to discard it. And that's how economic development actually unfolded in China successfully. This is how village elections unfolded, and many other good and successful policies. So this is something that people who work on China know about. This is one way of dealing with uncertainty. What I'm trying to discuss in this presentation is that another complementary method is really this kind of face-to-face deliberations among experts in China, and that there's actually some kind of an interaction between these face-to-face deliberations and what is going on the ground in local experiments. I mean, local experiments inform policy formulation at the top, and vice versa. Experts go to the ground, learn about experience, report on them, and that way also sometimes policies are adjusted, or what experts say or their input will inform future experiments. And as I said before, these are settings that are somewhat academics. I mean, seminars, discussion forums, conferences, and actually in China's system, conferences, meetings are a common thing. Here, the idea of what a meeting is supposed to be has been expanded in the political system to include this kind of deliberation, and a lot of times in these meetings, someone said these are venues for both intellectual and political work, that leaders, bureaucrats, and experts meet and discuss these issues. Of course, the format may be academic or quasi-academic, but the purpose is not theoretical, it's practical, of how to really solve issues, and specifically issues that are quite uncertain. Now, I will use a term that is very political science, very jargon, sorry for that, but the term is policy subsystem, and the idea is to explain that there are deliberations, of course, but there is a difference or variation in the quality and scope of deliberation. Sometimes it's more open, sometimes unproductive, sometimes less so. Policy subsystem refers to the actors that are in a certain policy, and sometimes the subsystem is structured differently. Sometimes there is hierarchy, the leaders are in charge of everything. Sometimes the leaders are still in charge, but they promote some kind of competition and discussion among experts, deliberately promote competition. And sometimes it's more horizontal. The leaders don't really intervene. They keep an arm's length distance from the process. And of course, these variations shape the outcome, or at least the quality of deliberation. If it's top-down, deliberation is more limited. If it's managed competition, it's more substantive and collaborative in some way. And in other cases that is horizontal, you would have more adversarial, but collaborative as well. There is some kind of a mix depending on the structure of authority within specific political subsystems. I'm going to talk about 4 examples. I will do injustice to some of them because we don't have time, and I want, and of course, yeah. I did more research on the first example, China's healthcare reform, very uncertain, very complex policy of horizontal subsystem, but I will give also examples that deal with the economic reform in China, specifically the price reforms. And I will talk about the one-child policy very briefly. So first talk about China's healthcare reform, a very, very complex issue, a horizontal system with bureaucratic actors with contending interests. And the issues that were there in the early 2000s, some of them are still, the problems are still today. In the post-socialist era or the reform era, government reduced its funding and created a great deal of inequality in access to health. The system was dysfunctional, specifically the public health system, the rural healthcare system, and the SARS outbreak was, of course, a wake-up call for the leadership and expose all the vulnerabilities of the system. And at the same time, the hospitals were running as for-profit organizations, even though they were public hospitals. A vast majority of the population did not have any access to healthcare insurance. And of course, the leaders were very, very uncertain. While the leaders had the means in the early 2000s to invest in the system, obviously in order to allow for universal access in a cost-efficient way, the leadership had to lead some kind of, conduct some major structural reforms, which they did not have any idea how to do. And obviously most of these leaders had zero experience in this field, and there were no successful examples of good healthcare systems abroad. So what to do? Delegate. So leaders don't know what to do. They delegate the process to the bureaucracies. And the bureaucracies, of course, have very contending and different interests, and they cannot reach any agreements. The leaders don't know what to do, so they decide to invite outside experts, and in this case, to invite 10 different organizations, Chinese universities, think tanks, but also international organizations, the WHO, the World Bank, and McKinsey, to actually write parallel competing blueprints to offer the government some ideas on how to reform and adjust the system, to provide universal healthcare, to undergo some kind of structural reforms in the structure of healthcare delivery, and so on. And actually, the government eventually, with the help of the British Department for International Development, organized a conference in which all these expert teams are invited to present their ideas, and then they also invited international experts to comment, to discuss, like in a real conference, the merits and the flaws of each one of these proposals. But the Chinese experts who are there, and the conference is dominated by those people who are very vocal, and they have some ideological debate that in some way mirrors the ongoing bureaucratic conflict. Whether this reform should be government-led or market-led. And there's no, and they cannot really agree. It's a very partisan discussion. And eventually, a bureaucracy there that is more neutral asked some of the international experts who were invited to comment on the blueprints to take some time off and to discuss among themselves what, based on the international experience, what would be the best way for China to go in order to reform its system, and whether we should go in the government way, government-led or market-led. And the experts actually discuss, and they don't have a clear answer to this question. And international examples of what system is better are inconclusive. So what they're saying, they don't really intervene in this conflict, but they do say what you do have to do is look at the supply side. That is, how hospitals are being funded, and how the pharmaceutical, all this thing is working, how doctors are being remunerated. And you have to reform all those mechanisms if you want to proceed with this reform, and if you want this reform to succeed. And so in many ways, they don't have a clear answer, but the fact that they didn't have a clear answer was important, and we know that in hindsight, because the decade afterwards, this conference was in 2007, during this decade, the government opened up a host of local experiments to figure out how to actually reform public hospitals, and eventually some of these experiments were in some way proved to be more successful. So that was a very mixed kind of system of deliberation. I mean, both there is adversarial deliberation, but also quite productive deliberation. Now, I don't know how much time do I have. These are, I'm sorry? Not much. Okay, so I'm doing an injustice to those cases, but I'm open to taking your questions. This is the 1980s. Big problem, moving from a planned economy to a market economy. In order to do that, you need to reform prices, you need to deregulate the prices, and how do you do it without creating an inflation that is going to lead to political stability? This is the challenge, this is the uncertainty, and this is why the government wants to have more expert deliberation, both Chinese and international one. And as we know, a Big Bang reforms, in other cases, something that was eventually avoided in China, led to a disaster in other post-socialist countries. And here there were also two conferences that were very crucial and in which there were very productive deliberations on how to do it. And in one of them, suggestion of a dual price system, a very gradual kind of system with a lot of adjustment that worked quite well for a while, and these ideas came through this expert deliberation. And of course, a very controversial issue, the one-child policy and how it was decided. Also an academic conference with people with background in ballistic missiles that proposed the one-child policy. The system was very hierarchical, top-down system. The leadership wanted strict birth control. They had the upper hand. Those who resisted were there, articulated their position, but later silenced, and we know the consequences. So another deliberation, but very limited in some sense. So these are the cases. Here there is a typo. I'm sorry for that. So deliberation is there. There are different. There are three different cases. These are cases from the past. The present is also quite complex. I have some ideas on what to say about that, but maybe. But that's something that I still need to research. So thank you for that, and I'm looking forward to your questions and suggestions.
Okay, we will. There's a general consensus in favor of beginning our coffee break just now. I do have a few questions myself, so I will ask them privately as well. Thank you all, and thank you for this very rich and also stimulating panel.